Thanks so much, Jay, for putting this all together and for the invitation. Appreciate it. And thanks for everybody making it all the way to the end here, this late afternoon final presentation. So I'm really glad to be here with you all, amongst you all in the San Luis Valley. It's a really, really beautiful, wonderful area. And this presentation, it's going to be a little bit more conceptual, a little bit more philosophical, not super technical, but just kind of musings and thoughts that I've had recently about kind of our place in the world, humans' place in the ecosystem, and just I feel like the land right now, the earth is really kind of asking us all to find our belonging again in the ecosystem. And through that kind of return to belonging with her and return to belonging in our communities. So just kind of inspired by that and just sharing some of my musings and thoughts, and hope it's inspiring for you all. So just a little overview. We'll do a little elk run case study. That's our home farm. I'm here with my love partner and her father, Marissa, and happy birthday, Steven. It's Steven's 65th birthday a couple days ago, so we're happy to have him with us too. So Elk Run's our home farm. We'll do a little bit of case study for ecosystem development on that, and then a little bit of historical context for different agricultural models. And then just a little bit touching on what kind of ecosystems can we design as humans to sort of find our belonging again in ecosystem and ecosystem development, and a little bit on how soil is built in nature and how this can inform our practices as land stewards and farmers. So just a little background, Elk Run Farm, that's now the demonstration site for our nonprofit, Drylands Agroecology Research, just north of Boulder, about 15 miles north of Boulder, just south of Lyons. And this property, I moved there actually in the fall of 2015. And this photo was taken that first spring after a bunch of rain. So this is about the greenest it ever looks there. And this property had actually no agricultural use for at least 15 or 20 years before that. Had been overgrazed by cattle significantly. Nobody had ever tried to grow crops there. There's not any water rights there. So just really wasn't considered a property viable for agriculture in any way. I moved there and started fixing up the buildings. I've been a carpenter landscaper since I was a kid. So just, starting to dive back into my understanding, my experience of what it's like to be a part of an ecosystem again. And this was the best place that I found myself, so it became my home. And then we started working, started designing the property. Again, hadn't been used for agriculture in a good while, just grazing before that. So just some of the practices we started to use, kind of going along with these permaculture principles and ideas we've been learning about today and the other presentations. We started using small-scale earthworks. So these are little basins that we were collecting water in. And I'll go back, actually. There's one important detail about this property that makes it very, very interesting. There's this large watershed above the property. So, this picture is sort of facing west, right along the foothills there. So it's this really big opportunity where snow and rain falls on this watershed. We calculated in a 1-inch rainstorm, about 1 million gallons of water falls on that watershed above us that drains through our property in 2 drainages. So for us, it's this understanding of how to resurrect this ecosystem using these opportunities that we had, which is mainly this big watershed above, or relatively big watershed above us. So, started simple, developed small-scale earthworks, was excited to try forest gardening, this concept I'd heard so much about, creating this forest rich of food and other herbs, medicines, things like that. So we started using earthworks with this idea that we would catch and store the water that ran off the hillside. All these different kinds of practices that maybe some of you have heard in permaculture design and practice. We started sheet mulching. These are some of these contour swales we dug in that forest garden, and you can see just how dry the property is, pretty desertifying property. Practice some cover cropping techniques, installed some gray water systems inspired by Art Ludwig's work, build an oasis with gray water. So all the water from the house we piped outwards into the contour swales that we had built in preparation to plant this forest garden. We used animal integration, so we got sheep and chickens and pigs that very first year. And for anybody getting into farming, that's one thing I don't recommend doing, just getting a bunch of different livestock all at the same time. But, we live and we learn, but just for future reference. But here we're actually and the sun's kind of on the screen, so it's a little hard to see. But this first little vegetable plot we had, I started running the sheep in this area that was to be the forest garden around that to kind of clear out all the weeds and prepare it for the other swales we were going to plant. And then we used pigs in all these areas that are now our grain fields. And I just was watching the pigs and what they did on the landscape, and saw how they cleared all the vegetation, all the weeds, and all the different things that weren't going to grow food. And as they started to shift the ecosystem, I watched as the more organic material I put in those fields, the more they dug it into the soil and the more topsoil they built, and just trying to keep it kind of sanitary, put bedding down for them, trying to keep it clean and all that. And they just turned all of it into the ground. And in an area that was parking for heavy machinery when I first moved there, in 2 years we'd built up almost 6 inches of topsoil just through these pigs, So just watching how these relationships with these other players, these other elements in the ecosystem, how much they can shape the ecosystem that we're a part of. So that's been a fun experiment for us. And this isn't really in chronological order. These are just slides that I pulled from other presentations that we've done, just to give like a little bit of a background, a little bit of idea about how we begun shifting this ecosystem. So in the lower fields, we dug swales and we built ponds. The controversy about that. They're actually called, we'll call them erosion basins. We can't call them ponds. But amongst you all, we'll say that. Every now and then, maybe sometimes, maybe even always, they hold water. But to most, they're called erosion basins. And that's actually worked quite well for us. No farmer wants erosion on their property. Nobody wants that. So the NRCS and government agencies realize that, the erosion basins are an acceptable way to collect and store water that happens to sink into the ground. So anyways, we did that. We didn't build ponds, we built erosion basins. We used keyline plows after we dug some contour swales to actually continue to build soil downwards, these plows that rip into the ground on contour. Just giving y'all a little spread of some of the practices, and you can go back up into your homes and look up some of these things if you want more information on them too. And so then in these places that the pigs had worked, we began prepping, plowing, and planting and harvesting staple grains by hand, all grains that are traditional staple food crops to the Southwest. So it was really cool seeing Jared up here too, and talking about Rich. All of our seeds came from Rich Pecoraro, and he helped me back a long time ago, kind of asked him, what are the most drought-tolerant seeds? What can we grow in this area? We have such little water, We can overhead water these fields for like a couple weeks in the spring, and that's it, and then they go drylands after that. And so what he gave me was Chihuahua Blue, and he gave me a couple different kinds of amaranth and some Hopi black bean seeds, and some sorghum, which is the only crop that we grow in our staple fields that is not traditional Southwest, but it's it's from Africa and very similar climates, very, very drought tolerant, even more drought tolerant we've found than the amaranth and the beans and the corn, interestingly enough. But then after the crops come down, we actually send our pigs back through to clear the fields, and then we send the chickens back through to clear the fields after that. And so in these really fast rotations that we're testing and demonstrating and now teaching other farmers in our area how to do. And I'll talk about it a little more later too, but then through the research that we've been doing, realizing that through these rotations, each and every year the topsoil builds. Each and every year the organic nutrients in the soil build. All the numbers are going up in the fields every single year just from these practices, just through those fast rotations with the livestock. Just continuing to build the ecosystems. That's us plowing the fields, plowing with pickaxes. And come to find out later that Hopi is the way that they plant corn too, is in these really deep plantings. And that was the intuition that I had. The deeper we can plant it, the more it'll collect the water that moves through the land. So that's us basically digging furrows all the way to the bottom of the topsoil that we had dug with the pigs. And what you hit there is that subsoil, that compacted subsoil that was just road base or whatever that was parked on before that. And just planting at the bottom of those furrows. And then I'll talk about it a little later, but then these hedgerows, this ecosystem development of the hedgerows in between the different crop fields. So you can see a little bit of that. And this is like a schematic map of how Elk Run looks. And there's a big dry hogback ridge in the middle of it. And then these, the mountains up here. And then all the different grain fields that we rotate the livestock through and grow the grains in. And then the dryland silvopasture below that. So actually using contour swales, we've been testing the ability to establish trees without supplemental irrigation. So that's kind of in our area what's sort of given us a sort of claim to fame in a way that we've established on just this property alone over 1,000 trees fruiting and useful for livestock without any supplemental irrigation using practices that we've developed. So this is the ecosystem, that we've built out of what was a developing desert. Built some buildings, finally got grant funding to build a nice livestock barn. Before that, our sheep were living in an old car trailer. So, humble means we do what we can, but some more of these livestock integrations, the pigs clearing the fields right before the chickens come in, and that balance of fertility that comes by using different animal systems in one field. And what's now a really thriving forest garden where we're growing all of our different medicinals and all of our different vegetables, fruits, and berries in the same place. And it's actually interesting, we've hit that point at the sort of beginning of the apex of that ecosystem we've developed where I'm having to transition vegetable crops out into other properties now, into other fields with more sun because the trees are starting to canopy, their fruit's growing, and it's a really beautiful experience to see that. And then at the same time, growing all sorts of medicinals. Marissa's an amazing herbalist too, so we're growing valerian, St. John's. Gosh, can you tell us all that we're growing? Yeah, perennials, those. Echinacea. Bunch of perennials. Really beautiful way to grow perennials too in this forest ecosystem. Really fun time doing that. And just a little, collage of some different fun activities, and really fun and exciting to have school kids on site. Marissa founded a school called Folk Farm Educational Program, and so 2.5 to 6-year-olds learning and growing on the farm, which is a really exciting part of our living ecosystem, so to speak. And then this is just a little bit of discussion around the actual silvopasture itself and the development of it. And everybody always asks me, oh, what are the before pictures like? Did you take before pictures? So I say, well, before mostly, because I didn't, you never think to take a picture of nothing, right? And this acreage that you see in that second picture, this is right before we planted it, right? And I wish I had taken a picture of it when I'd first gotten there, because what you would have seen, what I saw, was 5 acres completely desertified by prairie dogs, no topsoil, no vegetation, nothing at all there. And so the first thing I did when I moved to the property, I called up the local NRCS office, Natural Resource Conservation Services. If anybody that doesn't know what that group is, started a group of the program of the USDA started after the Dust Bowl to help farmers and ranchers conserve natural resources on their property. So excited, young farmer, me. So what do I do? I want to restore this property. I want to grow food. I want to run livestock. What conservation practices do you have for me? And they kind of basically told me, sorry, we don't have anything that's viable for this quality of land. You're better off going somewhere else to farm. Okay, well, luckily we've been studying permaculture design. We've been working with different mentors and teachers. We think we have an idea. We're going to catch and store all the water on the property. So actually in this lower field, the reason why I say before mostly is because for a year on each side of this ravine that's in the middle, right about there, had medium-sized herds of pigs, maybe 5 or 6 pigs running through that whole area, and I found a horse farmer that was willing to bring truckloads of manure, or dump trailer loads of manure and pile them butt to butt in those fields and just had the pigs run through all of it. So just built up there that compost, that 1 inch of topsoil layer from those pigs running through those fields each side for about a year. And then after that, I'd kind of pinned in on a design that I wanted to use for the contour system, for the way that we were going to move the water through the property. And so this is us just cutting the swales in first with a skid steer. We've ended up using more like digging type machines, more like excavators and backhoes since then. But just practicing, learning. So, you see the soil is quite rich, actually, that we're scooping out, and then you can see the subsoil below that. So that's why I say before mostly, because actually pigs had been in there for about 2 years before that. So again, just us acclimating to our ecosystem, understanding what we wanted to build and create to develop this ecosystem. And now, that's the center picture is just those same fields that next year we got kind of a wet spring, and we just see the little trees planted in that rabbit cage at first, and then the first year we saw grass growing back into the pastures. So just us in our process of reacclimating to the ecosystem and building where we wanted to live. And this is a picture from the top of the hill in summer 2022 of the ecosystem that we've built there. Just a little flashback to spring 2016. Yes, that's really exciting to me. Just a way to show in a way what's possible with these approaches, with these mentalities, with these ideologies, what kinds of ecosystems we can build and create. So then in 2020, we formally founded the nonprofit Drylands Agroecology Research with the purpose of restoring the earth and our communities through regenerative design. Excuse me. And the main pillars or branches of the nonprofit are, the way we see it is, land regeneration and stewardship is really the foundational pillar to this cultural regeneration that we want to see. Without the land, we're nothing. There's no community without healthy land. And then from there, we're researching those systems. So we ended up hiring a consultant from a university and helping us develop a research program to actually get data on the different systems that we were building at Elk Run, and then the ability to take that same program to every different property that we've now been working on, just to show in science and data what is actually happening with the soil building and the ecosystemic functions and all of that. And then from there, realizing that in most marginalized landscapes, you'll find marginalized people. And, in the West, especially, and in America, that's, indigenous peoples primarily have been moved off their lands, place-based cultures that have been deeply connected and rooted to a place, and they've been pushed off by Western culture to marginalized landscapes. So just recognizing and realizing that the reemergence of that knowledge and that understanding and those value sets, as well as to shift the oppression of one culture by another, is deeply important to the regeneration of communities and culture and ecosystems, ultimately. And then through those understandings and those different practices and programs, we recognize that we need to educate as many other people as possible on these different systems, models, practices, ideologies, and ways to shift ecosystems and communities through these regenerative design practices. So that's just a little bit about the nonprofit. Our two main steward partner farms are Metacarbon Farm, which is 60 acres just right across the street from us. Another 10 acres of silvopasture, another 40 acres of grant-funded silvopasture that's going in this summer. And then we have pig and vegetable systems in partnership with the farmer there. And then Yellow Barn Farm is another 100 acres down the road where we now have our cattle and our other pig systems. And so basically running animals and livestock through all these different ecosystems that we're building and connecting this sort of community hub in the Front Range of Boulder County. And then just different private projects that we're doing. This is like what we're working on right now is like a 5-acre contour orchard for some neighbors of ours. And then different programs that we're using just to regenerate culture and community. So this is another almost 3/4 acre plot at Yellow Barn Farm where we're growing an indigenous foods garden to help revitalize traditional and staple foods of indigenous communities in our area, and partnering with communities to bring folks on to connect with the land, to work with the land, and then just share and distribute those good foods from there. So just wanting to really drive home this point that to us and to our thoughts around this is that all these ecological, economic, cultural, and social systems are deeply interconnected, and so it's really important at this time in what some of our advisors call like the polycrisis, what's happening on Earth today where many systems are breaking down at the same time, just how deeply interconnected these systems are, and through understanding those connections, we can start to design and develop ways to repair those systems. And for me, the belief that I have is, again, us entering into belonging again with the ecosystems that we're a part of. So just a little bit of background on all that to get to really kind of the essence of what I want to share about. So just want to give a little bit of historical context and just acknowledging that this is just kind of my little story. This isn't the only story of history. It's just one story. So just some thoughts and ideas that I have. As I've heard, the agricultural revolution started about 6,000 years ago. And the way that I understand it, that first plow was invented, in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, Egypt, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, these places that folklore says were the most fertile places on planet Earth, the most wonderful, amazing places to be and to live. And from my understanding, right around that time, humans started plowing over perennial grasslands ecosystems and growing grains. And I think it's an interesting thing to note that the people that those grains were intended to feed were likely large populations of indentured, enslaved, and oppressed people, right? So it's that connection, right, between the oppression of the landscape and the oppression of the cultures themselves. So just kind of drawing attention to that. And, as we all likely know, what do those places look like today? They're some of the most desertified and degraded landscapes on Earth. So just something to keep in mind. Well, at the same time in our stories, how some cultures call Turtle Island, they say there's journal entries from some of those first European settlers that landed on the eastern seaboard that describe what they saw. And the way that I recall it, those stories, they describe such amazing, lush, abundant ecosystems where there's nut trees hundreds of feet tall in the air. And below that, fruiting trees dripping with fruit below that, and then berry bushes below that. And vines of squashes and foods growing all below that. Wow, what amazing ecology this place is. Without even realizing that what they were seeing was agriculture, or agroecology maybe. Or horticulture, or place-based relationality with ecosystem, Maybe the English language doesn't even have the right words to describe this relationship that humans had with ecology in these places, So these are things for me where I draw inspiration from that to imagine how to, again, belong to ecosystem in that kind of a way. So then for me, it just begs this question, are we participating in our ecosystems or are we controlling it? And this is just one simple English phrase, that we could write in poetry for years to understand, to reimagine what it is to be a part of an ecosystem again. And so just with that, I like to remind myself and to all of us here that, this place that we now call the San Luis Valley, from my understanding, this is ancestral Ute territory, a migratory band of Plains people, that stayed here for many, many, many generations, called this place home. So just acknowledging that, acknowledging where we are and how we got here as people too. And then at the same time, the folklore says that this area was some of the most abundant summer hunting grounds, bison running all through here. And different tribes come to trade and exchange and rendezvous here, like the Tewa, the Dene, and then contemporary tribes like the Comanche and Apache. And interestingly to me, like from my understanding, it's interesting to think about. Well, Comanche and Apache, they came from other tribes. Because of Western expansion, they were pushed out of their territory and became warring and fighting people. So just something interesting to think about, that isn't always taught in public education that I heard, Interestingly enough, I went through at least 12 years of public education in Colorado in Boulder County, and not one time did anybody tell me that there was a Native American reservation in the United States. Not to mention Native American reservations in Colorado. Just an interesting tidbit, of the erasure of culture, and what that means for us in today's society and how our efforts to return to belonging with place, So just thoughts that I have, nothing more than that really. I just want to share that. And so then from an ecological perspective, the USDA has this concept of ecoregions, and again, these are just concepts, human constructs of way that we can understand where we are and how we got here and what we're going to do, So I think it's important, at least for us, when we're developing ecosystems or, agroecological systems, ecosystems that are intended to grow food, at least just understand what we're starting with, what the baseline is, because I think that tells us how far we can get in that succession of an ecosystem based on kind of where we're starting, because for me, I've done most of my growing in Colorado, and it's just unrealistic to think about growing certain kinds of ecosystems where I am. And so in that same fashion, so the USDA describes this valley here under these ecoregions, San Luis shrublands and San Luis alluvial flats and wetlands. And I think that's an interesting piece for us to understand and what kind of ecosystems you as stewards here in this valley might be interested in developing. This concept of wetlands suggests that there's plenty of water, and that to me suggests that there's a variety of different ecosystems that grow food that can be developed in this region. So just something to think about. So with that in mind, I guess I'm just asking the question, what kind of ecosystems might we want to design? So what if we imagined our vegetable plots as sunny meadows in a riparian ecosystem? What would that tell us about how to shape it, how to build it, what kind of plants to use? Hearing some tidbits from the last presentation, how the wind is strong in this valley. What can we do to collect water in certain places to grow windbreaks, to serve as the windbreaks to our sunny riparian meadows that we grow our vegetables in? What could that mean for us as growers, as producers, as land stewards, as people wanting to belong to our ecosystems again? Just again, keeping in mind that we're in a drylands ecoregion, so really most of the growing that we want to do, the way I see it, the way I understand it, most of the growing that we're doing in our drylands ecoregions are in this riparian zone. So to me, that's why I use earthworks. That's why I use contour swales and the shaping of land and erosion basins and collections to develop ecosystems, is because the way I see it, we are redirecting and shaping out more riparian ecosystems with our earthworks, right? So just understanding how we can collect, store, and distribute water to create those riparian ecosystems that have the ability to grow all the food that we want in this climate region. So just things to keep in mind. How can we imagine our forest gardens as our ecosystems for all of our fruits and medicines? Like I was describing in our little case study of elk run, how simple and easy it is to grow perennial herbs and medicines in a forest, So how these different elements work together, like we've been talking about in our other presentations, like how Kelly shared, how these different elements work together to create balance, Just giving some examples. And then my curiosity is around how can we use these silvopasture concepts? Silvo is Latin for tree, right? So a silvopasture is a pasture with trees in it. And the USDA has information on how silvopastures are built and developed. This is agroforestry practices that the USDA has now taken on and understand as simple conservation practices. And so to the USDA, building silvopastures is either planting trees into pasture or thinning woodlands to create open meadows or open pasture alleys inside of woodlands. And for me in my work, a lot of what I've found is that mostly we're planting into pastures and creating silvopastures out of that. And I think of it as kind of stretching the capacity of our ecosystems from these shrublands, from these shrublands that we see, and then pulling out these wetlands and into riparian areas into our shrublands. That's kind of how I see the contour swales working, and how we're building silvopastures or savannas, as some of our mentors and teachers talk about these ecosystems. And almost how the beauty of a silvopasture is that there's 3 dimensions of forage growing, right? In a pasture, there's just grass for the cows to eat or the chickens to eat. And then in a silvopasture, there's not only just the grass, but then the forbs that are growing in the alleys, and then the shrubs, the leaves. If we're planting trees that the animals like to eat, or they're dropping fruit the animals like to eat. So all these different ecosystemic benefits that are connected as we are developing our ecosystems that produce food. So again, just really simple benefits, just to break it down even a little bit farther, right? These trees and shrubs break wind, really simple, right? This prevents drying on our lands. We can grow more food. The way I see it in Colorado, most places in Colorado and any drier areas, we are limited in the ecosystems that we can develop by how much water that we have. So the stronger ability that we have to collect water and to store water, that's the amount of food that we can grow. That's the amount of ecosystem that we can develop. That's the amount of agroecology that we can, again, belong to. So just using trees and shrubs is a really effective way to do that, I think. And then the more scientific kind of explanation of that, the evapotranspiration of the leaves. So maybe some folks have heard of that. There's moisture being let off by the trees, and that process is keeping the microclimates dry around the trees. And it's a beautiful thing. Science is finally catching up to indigenous wisdom and recognizing that the evapotranspiration from trees, along with microbiology that the tree leaves let off, that is actually what brings rain to land. That when clouds of moisture pass over, that it's the evapotranspiration, and especially that microbiology that turns into the little nucleus of a raindrop that allows rain to fall on that land. So where there are forests, those clouds will drop rain. And where there is dry lands or deserts, those clouds will pass by, and they will wait till they get to the forests to drop their rain. So we really can bring back the rain and accelerate this ecosystem development by this building of ecosystem architecture using trees, shrubs, and other perennial plants. And then just even a little bit further to break it down, the simple ecosystem function that we are creating by building these ecosystems that are founded, that are nestled in by trees and shrubs. This high diversity in the ecosystem creates habitat for insects and bugs, and then all the different flowers. It's really simple, right? All the different flowers from all the fruit trees that we planted and all the berry bushes, that at different times of the year is attracting insects that want to be there, that are helping stabilize that ecosystem. I think this is a fun picture. In permaculture design, they talk about how this plant family, this is a fennel plant going to flower. Umbellifery family, like carrot family plant, how these plants bring beneficial wasps that actually eat aphids, and so it's really been fun for me to witness that and recognize that process happening, and these plants in our garden just absolutely filled with wasps, and realizing how those wasps come in and they regulate all the different pests that are eating our crops. Just these simple practices, how ecosystems are self-stabilizing in their essence, and so our desire to reconnect with them and to create them and build them is what allows that balance to come again into our ecosystems. And so then along those lines, and again, this is just really philosophy, right? This isn't really just a lot of practices necessarily, but just for concept, just for philosophy, just a little bit of discussion on how soil is built in nature. Just again, so we can understand as humans how to reintegrate ourselves into the ecosystem. Of all things, lichens are the first things in nature to build soil. So this is, to me, a very comforting thought that even if somehow it would all be wiped out altogether, right? The lichens would come back and make that first layer of soil just from rocks. They're the only, and they're actually a symbiotic colony of fungus and bacteria, right? Bacteria and funguses that are naturally in our atmosphere. So even from just rock, those two things would come together and start building that first layer of soil from nothing. So that's just the first step in succession, what ecologists call succession. So then pioneer species come into the ecosystem from what was just very little bit of topsoil, and as most of us understand, with little topsoil, the soil doesn't have the ability to hold water as well. So really it's the pioneer species that come in after that and begin to create the pathways for the next successions of plants to come. As many of us also realize, these are typically common weeds, right? Plants that we think of as invasive sometimes, and usually very medicinal plants. So things like dandelion, things like wild lettuce, things like burdock thistle even. Plants that come in and pioneer the soil, pioneer the ecosystem, and lay a foundation for the other plants in the successional process to come. And so again, just a little bit of a nice visual to understand this ecosystemic process of succession. So again, from exposed rocks, lichens and mosses come, and then annual weeds, perennial weeds and grasses, and then every ecosystem, it wants to evolve into a forest, right? Only limited by the natural resources that are in any location, any climate, any microclimate, any biome. So, I think this slide isn't necessarily relevant at the end for our ecosystems, because our forests are not going to become beech and maple broadleaf forests. We don't have the water. We really don't. We don't have the moisture, the humidity to do that. But just this, to me, this slide is showing us, well, if every ecosystem wants to succeed, to develop through succession into a forest, if we're just continuously limiting and stopping that development at the annual vegetable stage, how challenging is this for us? And how challenging is this for the ecology itself, right? We're fighting an uphill battle constantly trying to hold ecology at a certain place, So I think this informs our practices. Like I'm not suggesting to not grow annual foods, but to understand where in our ecosystems those annual foods go. Where in our perennial systems can different crops go that promote balance? So just interesting things to think about, I think. And just again, a little bit of this process of how forests build soil. Basically, trees are just mining minerals and vitamins out of the subsoil that other plants can't access, right? Trees having these deep roots that mine deep into the ground off of the subsoil, and then making tree leaf vegetation, and then every year dropping those leaves. And that's the process, really, that topsoil is getting built up in a forest. And they say that in 1,000 years, about 1 inch of topsoil is built, So if we're sheet mulching or we're applying compost, think about how much we're accelerating that ecosystemic process. And so I think it's important, at least just to understand these processes for us as practitioners and stewards to decide how we want to enter the ecosystem and when we want to enter the ecosystem. Thank you. And then a little bit of maybe not a side note, but a little piece on that, just for us in this valley too, and for us on the Front Range as well, to understand is that all grasslands evolved with ruminids, right? So around here and then in the West, everywhere really, huge bison herds were naturally rotationally grazing themselves through these ecosystems. And so to me, I think that it's even hard for us to understand how strong, how diverse, and how effective these ecosystems were before the elimination of the bison, And even this concept, to me, it's not too far away from the dominion and oppression of landscapes from, the agricultural revolution, right? Where, to my understanding, the erasure of the bison was an intentional gesture by Europeans on this continent to erase the cultures, communities, and peoples that relied so heavily upon them, And so just interesting to think about that in this shrubland, it was essentially managed by bison. And so for me, this is really interesting thing that I think about, we have cattle, we rotationally graze them, if it's a wonderful practice, holistic management, look it up, read into it. It's a, hot thing in regenerative agriculture right now, a way to build soil, sequester carbon, and every day we set up fences and we take them down and we, through our gestures diligently press these cows to rotationally graze, right? Every single day. Where maybe not even many more than a couple hundred years ago, communities could come to this area and make one honorable harvest of meat a year and have food for the entire year. And at the same time, those bison were rotationally grazing, in quote, themselves all over because of how the ecosystem was. I think about those kind of things, So maybe at that same level, it's our responsibility now to simulate those ecosystemic processes, And one way we can do that is with cows or other livestock. So just things to think about, Maybe that's our responsibility. So then again, just the context that we're discussing this in, how are grasslands building topsoil? Just so we can understand why grazing is important, maybe. As the above ground vegetation is eaten, trampled, and fertilized with manure, the same amount of plant material dies from the roots, right? So if there's 7 inches of grass and 7 inches of roots, when 3 or 4 inches of the top of the grass are bitten off, digested by the cows, then those 4 inches of roots slough off, and that turns into topsoil. So this rotation, this natural rotational grazing of bison through this valley for thousands of years was constantly building topsoil. And it helps us to understand, again, how we want to enter our own ecosystems. So just, simple ways that we can simulate these processes, just going back to a slide before, sheet mulching in a way is doing that, is just putting down that organic matter right on top, layering that organic matter like some of us do in our own gardens. Cover cropping, to me, is a way of using pioneer species to either change or shift the consistency of a topsoil or the properties of a topsoil. And then put more material back into the ground, And there's a lot of different ways to use cover crops. Everybody can do their own research, and probably people in this room use cover crops in their own way. But for us, one way we like to use them is after pigs and chickens come through a system. If we seed cover crops, the soil is then, by the time those cover crops grow, like the mustards and some buckwheats, they can tolerate that soil being a little hot or being a little bit out of balance with the fresh manure on it. But then those plants grow up, and then we can cut those and turn those back into the soil, and then those fields are ready for those later succession foods that we want to grow, that we've prepared the soil with those cover crops. It's just little ways that we can think, through our own ingenuity and creativity of how to re-enter the ecosystems of our agroecological systems. So again, rotational grazing of livestock, many different ways to do that, many different schools of thought in which to do that. But again, if there's grass, those ecosystems evolved with ruminants, some kind of grazing animal. So it just begs the question again, if we want to maintain balance with those ecosystems, is it appropriate to graze them? So again, for me, just continues to ask this question, how do we want to participate in the ecosystems that we develop? So I think that's mostly what I got. And just, again, last slide, just thinking about like on the grand scale, how we can use this in all of the agricultural systems that we're developing worldwide to basically tackle or work with the climate issues, the food insecurity issues, all the different challenges that we're facing. It's like, how can we build ecosystems and then become a part of them again to make all the cultural, ecological, and social shifts that we want to make on this planet to revitalize our life as human beings. So I think that's what I got. Stay connected. Come visit us up in the Front Range if you're all are around. We're going to be planting like about 6,000 trees at Yellow Barn Farm, all dryland systems, every weekend of April. So if anybody is in town, come visit for that. Do you have announcements? Okay, so those other ones are taken already. Yeah, so what dates? April 15th and April 22nd, we're going to be planting trees with all volunteers, all community-supported stuff at Yellow Barn Farm. A lot of cool stuff happening. If you're in the area, come visit. We're mostly community-minded people and parties, celebrations, all that. So come visit, come join, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Any questions?
Oh, yeah. Questions?
Yeah, please use the mics.
Yeah.
Step right up.
Wow, it's so inspiring to see how your vision and your hard work has developed this land in such a beautiful way. So I so appreciate this, and I wonder what you're thinking that could help with. I know your area because I live in that area. The floods and the fire, is that built into your plan, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, large-scale, landscape-scale earthworks and water management are the solution for most of that stuff, right? So large-scale earthworks create planting habitat in otherwise places that could not be planted with trees and shrubs, right? So then from there, those same, and deciduous plants actually break fire, right? So when conifer forests are burning, when they get to the edge of a deciduous shrub or wetlands or whatever, the fire is slowed down because of that evapotranspiration that's happening at that windbreak layer that we've built or whatever that layer is. And so then at the same time, when those floods come, those earthworks, the way that they're designed, they catch and store every single drop of water that lands on that property. So there's no flooding at all, actually. Like the water is managed in such a precise way that it's just going to the plants that we want to grow, that are actually going to feed our livestock and are going to feed us later on. And so all of this comes from a concept called keyline design theory. It came from some folks in Australia in the 1950s-ish, and it's been elaborated upon extensively by permaculture designers and regenerative farmers, namely Mark Shepard. And the idea is to direct water out of wet valleys onto dry ridges. That's the whole basis of the practice, more or less, and collect water where it's first easily caught on a landscape. That's called the key point, where the land inflects. And so there's a lot to talk about with that, but that's the basis of it. Yeah. Other questions? Cool.
Do you guys do more in-depth trainings on ecological system design?
Yeah, we're building capacity for that too. But then we are part of a permaculture design course up in Boulder County. And then we want to start having more classes for like forest gardening and ecology. There's going to be a agroforestry conference. Gosh, I'm kind of out of the loop because I'm always on projects, but there you go. July 11th through 14th. 13th? Yeah, so we're going to be giving a tour at some of our agroforestry systems that day. I think I'm going to be talking at the conference in Denver. That's one place to start plugging in. Just join the newsletter too. There's going to be more educational opportunities as we kind of expand too. So, yeah. Yeah.
I got one for you. What are the metrics you measure right now, and what are the metrics that you would have liked to have measured from the beginning?
Good question, yeah. I mean, even photo documentation of everything, like that's a must now. Like, because we're actually working on sites that look like what Elk Run did before we started, and so now we can actually get photo representation, which we don't have originally. But then now I think we're taking water infiltration rates. It's funny again, because I helped design the system and then design myself out of the research system. So it's now run by our research director, Amy. But then in terms of simple metrics, so carbon sequestration, soil carbon, and then all your NPK stuff is always tested twice a year. And then again, water infiltration rates. There's a bulk density test to understand like the density of the soil itself, and then a lot of like ecosystem function tests, like catching bugs in these big old nets, yeah, and just seeing basically how many bugs and how many worms are in one certain test area is like one of the best ways to understand how the ecosystem itself is developing. So those are things that would have been good to catch from the beginning, but again, it was basically like nothing. So we started mostly zero to something. Yeah, and then the survival rate of the trees. So like we're up to like 75 to 85% survival rate on trees planted in dryland systems, which is pretty cool. Yeah, and so in all of our systems too, I think it's cool to note that the trees, assuming we would lose at least half the trees, we planted them about 1.5 feet apart. So after the first year, we lost less than 10%, and then since then lost another 5% or so. So it's pretty cool realizing that what we built was this whole breeding program basically for drylands agroforestry, because there's so many different kinds of the same plant all in these systems, and some are doing better than others. Some are going to have better fruit. Some are going to be more drought intolerant over a certain period. So to me, that's part of the interesting research too. And it's also like the data collection to me is just to tell a story to people that aren't on the land. Like we can see it and feel it. Like we're sentient human beings with minds and hearts, and we can sense and feel all that's going on, you know. It's the data that's telling somebody in a boardroom somewhere what's happening, you know. And that's to me the way I explain it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Curious what species of trees and shrubs have done best and which ones haven't, and what are the metrics, your specific context of, you know, how much rainfall and how much are those trees and shrubs getting. Yeah, that would be really interesting. And if that data is being collected, then is there some way to access that data? Because that is super hard to find anywhere.
Yeah, 100%. So a lot of it's in our latest annual report too, and then we have research documents all throughout the website that you can access. But it was like I made assumptions right off the bat of what stuff I thought would be viable agroforestry crops. But for fruiting plants, apple, pear, and mulberry are actually been doing quite well. Mulberry, the leaves are really delicious for ruminids also, like really soft, edible leaves. And then honey locusts are quite drought tolerant. Black locust is like the most drought tolerant, but then there's the kind of issue with the thorns and stuff. So in some systems, there may be tighter alleys. People don't want the thorns, or we don't want the thorns because it's going to be too hard to manage. But black locust and honey locust, the leaves are like alfalfa on a tree. It's like super high density, you know, leguminous, protein rich leaves, right? So those are really effective agroforestry plants. And for us, it's like this concept that, again, within that diversity of an ecosystem, we're planting a nitrogen fixing plant in between every fruiting plant and testing a bunch of different stuff. The other stuff we're testing is currants. Again, mostly native stuff. I mean, the apples are Antignova apple, so that comes from Russia. That's like one of the Siberian pea shrubs, yeah. They're all like ecological analogs to our area, where like Siberian pea shrubs developed in the Siberian steppe, which is very similar to our ecoregion in a lot of ways. And then false indigo is another nitrogen-fixing shrub that does quite well. The plums and the Nanking cherries and things like that do all right, but the apples and the pears are doing quite well. Yeah. And yeah, find that info on the website. Any other questions? Did you have a question? Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've got like 10 questions.
Go for it. You can email me too. Write down the email if you want.
Did you ever go back to the NRCS and show them what you did?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, then they were going to give us equip funding. They're like, wow, this is so awesome. We're going to equip. Equip funding is like how they donate money to for conservation easements or like for landowners doing conservation stuff. And then we didn't rank high enough in the equip funding to even get the money that year. So like, we don't need you guys anyway. But then, City of Boulder and County of Boulder have been big partners of us lately. Just realizing that it's the ideologies in those groups that is the most hindering for what we're doing. Like they don't even see what we're doing as relevant. Even like ag schools like CSU, it's like trying to explain to somebody something that they're like, we have no reference for this. We have no reference for why this is important at all. But luckily, the City of Boulder and County of Boulder have gotten pretty interested in what we're doing and starting to fund us restoring some of their land too. So, yeah.
You mentioned going to a university or some sort of university group. Who was that? Was that CSU or UC Boulder? Or?
Yeah, I went to CU Boulder. I grew up in Boulder too, but I was a competitive freestyle skier until I was like 20. Had like a existential crisis and moved to Amazon or Peru and was down there for like 3 years in Peru, Colombia. Kind of reintegrated into the University of Life and then could not get back into college. So, permaculture design and regenerative ag, that kind of like sparked my intellectual side again, but I never finished school. And in a lot of ways that like, the dogma of those institutions, I think is very limiting for people wanting to enter back into relationship with ecosystem. So for me, just being a part of ecosystem, that's how I think, learned what I wanted to learn. And I'm still learning a lot, every day. So. More questions? All right.
I heard you say that you're using largely native plants, but some of them are also from Siberia and stuff. When you test for bugs, have you seen an increase in the level of native bees and native insects? And have you seen an increase in bird life and elk run from when it was just a prairie dog desert to what it is now?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, for me as an observer, like not a science person, the birds returning was the first sign to me that we were doing the right thing. Like, what's that Colorado native bird with the orange and red tanagers? Wow, that maybe it's like the third year we were planting out the forest garden was growing. Those western tanagers would start coming back in early June, and then they'd return in late September. And just seeing those birds that look like parrots, oh, wow, just that feeling in my heart like, okay, I think we're doing the right thing. Definitely doing the right thing. Because, magpies, everything's just, they're coming for the fruits. Grasshoppers, everything comes in hordes, and it's something that it's like, at first we want to try to prevent it or stop it or have some fix for it, like especially the grasshoppers. Like some years the grasshoppers would come in and just like wipe out a bunch of crops. And then just kind of stepping back and realizing that the ecosystem itself wants to find balance, So then the flickers, then they come in and they start eating all the bugs, And all those little pine beetles, boy, those flickers come and start eating those, and there's big old groups of flickers coming in and destroying them. So yeah, definitely tons of birds, and a really hard piece to scientifically note. Apparently, like I've been asking the different research groups, like how do we track that? And whether, or unless you're there like all the time taking pictures of all the birds, which I'm not the one doing that, I'm just the one admiring them. It's a hard thing to actually like track scientifically, but what I've seen is just immense amounts of especially bird life coming back. And then the way birds transport and deliver seeds to different places, to me they're a very important, valuable messenger of our work, and also like bringer of seed propagule from native communities, and how the things that come up in our forest garden, they're mostly stuff we didn't seed, that we've created the right niches for those plants to come up that are medicinal and edible, and then they return to our ecosystems. And so I think the birds are mostly what are doing that too, bringing that. Yeah, good. Yeah, I get sidetracked. Yeah. Yeah, and the mason bees too, they're definitely returning strongly. And the way that I've seen it, the ecological analog plants, like the plants that aren't truly native to this, there's this big debate between truly endemic species and invasive plants and when they came and all that. But what I've noticed is that the plants that are ecological analogs that do well in these other climates that are very similar to our climate, the mason bees like them just the same. The different beneficial wasps and the other insects that do pollination, they like them just the same. And so we're still building like different hives for the mason bees and stuff, and have other honeybees too. Just trying to do as much as possible, like that, not relying on any one piece to hold all of that, like, so those are just my simple thoughts on that. I think that's time. Thank you, everybody.